Hi there, my name is Cecilia Pellegrini, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about the way we should rethink domesticity and cohabitation, since we are in the third day now of the workshop Post-occupancy toward a multi-agent cohabitation. I want to start with a quote of the book La Casa y la Multitud of Anaí Valent and Jorge Francisco Liernur, in which they write that the house is a material object and at the same time a social representation. I want to clarify that the images you are seeing are random references from architecture and art on this subject. And please don't worry about taking notes from the images, because this class will be recorded and uploaded in YouTube, so you can watch it as many times as you want. So Liernur and Valent also stated that, I quote, "The house is used as a means to prefigure the times to come," closing quote. This is the game we are playing in this workshop. We are using social housing projects to imagine future scenarios, hopefully better future scenarios than the ones we are living today. And if we understand the importance of the house as a social representation, we can unveil these projects and rebuild them with a new formal and material proposal. With that in mind, I want to talk to you about the social role of the house. The house is no longer a fixed element. The image of the house as a shelter and as an envelope has been long gone. We currently live in a dynamic world surrounded by constant stimulation and different activities that are molding us in a social and cultural way. Lately, our day-to-day reality is changing so fast that it's difficult for us to get used to anything, especially regarding technology and the environment. This ever-changing world obviously has a great impact on ourselves and on the way we live with and relate to others. And most importantly, this dynamic way of life shapes the way in which we inhabit the main scene of our day-to-day life, our house. You already know that each architectural element plays an important role in the way we occupy a space. As obstacles or as bridges, those elements have a great influence on how much the users appropriate each space and relate with each other. In his essay, Figures, Doors, and Passages, Robin Evans studies different houses in dialogue with pieces of art and literature. He draws a line in the mid-17th century when, according to him, the domestic life has suffered an important change due to a radical transformation in domestic architecture, the appearance of the corridor. According to Evans, the corridors reduce the interaction between the co-livers due to a segregation of each space and each function. The typical distribution of corridors connecting terminal rooms replaced the fluid network of thoroughfare rooms. And he explains that before the mid-17th century, there was no difference and no hierarchy between the paths that lay across a house and the rooms they connected. And so the house was a matrix of interconnected chambers. Evans argues that this motivated interaction and socialization between the different members of a household due to a permanent intersection of different activities. Therefore, the distinction between dynamic spaces and static spaces didn't exist. So, quoting Evans, company was the ordinary condition and solitude the exceptional state. End of quote. It's clear that topics such as domesticity and cohabitation can't be studied only from a material point of view. And we must take into consideration the social implications of our formal and architectural decisions. The house is now more than ever a place for cultural and political debate, in a world in which we finally understood that everything that is personal is political, and that some political issues are as local as they are universal. We need to reconsider the idea of domesticity. From this point of view, we could speak about the end of domesticity space as we know it. The most common attributes of domestic space, the idea of interior, of intimacy, and of shelter, are fading away and giving us the opportunity of looking over them from a critical point of view and to redefine the notion of domesticity and the way we build the spaces for cohabitation. We could start by questioning the very use of the term domesticity to refer to the private sphere as a synonym of the home and of an intimate space. We could start by acknowledging that those are different terms and only sometimes collide in the same space that only sometimes is our home. Not to mention the fact that most of the times for women, our own house is one of the most dangerous places to be. In Argentina, for example, more than 90% of the cases of gender-based violence happen in the domestic space. Nowadays, we can't imagine a better future for social housing and cohabitation without gender perspective. To this end, the incorporation of feminist studies has been crucial, and thanks to them, we have learned that although the concept of domesticity is a cultural construction, and as such is in permanent transformation, historically, domestic space is opposed to savagery and implies obedience and subordination. For instance, the first monolingual dictionary of Spanish published in the 17th century, El Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española by Sebastián de Covarrubias, directly relates the word domestic with the adjectives docile, gentle, and obedient. I'm quoting the definition: domestic, everything that is raised at home and for this reason is submissive and gentle, more than what is raised in the countryside. And not only we call the animal domestic, but also the one that is obedient to the father or master. So it's clear for all to see that the internal dialectic that hides in the notion of domesticity. The duality between the physical space of a dwelling and the idea of nurturing, of a hierarchical and patriarchal family. It's striking that in a world filled with so many different cohabitation relationships, with so many different loving and caring and even nurturing relationships, the image of the house remains attached to the image of domestic space and therefore of the nuclear family. Furthermore, it's interesting to point out that in the Greek language, the word domus defines the dwelling and its interior and shares its etymological root with the word dominus, domination, while the word oikos refers to a family understood as the key element of society. But not only it refers to its members of the family, but also the space where they live in, including their belongings. The Greek polis was based on the difference between the house as a private sphere and the city as a public and collective sphere. The house being the sphere destined to reproductive and productive activities, clearly separated from the agora, the political sphere. We can highlight here the clear division between private and public, private and political. Pier Vittorio Aureli and Maria Sherazade Shuichi, in their text Familiar Horror Toward a Critique of Domestic Space, argue that in this sense, the Greek house, the oikos, is made, and I quote, is made of three kinds of relationships: the despotic relationship between master and slave, the conjugal relationship between husband and wife, and the parental relationship between parent and child. End of quote. All these relationships were unequal and were based on hierarchies of power and subordination. All three continue to exist today with the same level of inequality but different titles. I'm quoting again Aurelian Giudici, this eventually led to redefining the role of women as non-productive, separating them from any control over the economy of their existence and constructing a legally acceptable form of slavery. End of quote. This argument is also supported by Caroline Merchant in her book, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, in which she proposes to unveil the manipulation of the image of nature and women to justify their exploitation and discrimination in favor of the economic power of men. In this book, Merchant reports that the passive role assigned to nature and women since the 16th century, as opposed to the active role given to science and men, an unequal binarism that has been fostered for more than 500 years. Today, on the other hand, the house reveals itself as an agora, as a stage for the political affairs of its different users. More than ever, intimate interiors play a fundamental role in social and political construction, and therefore are one of the most important topics for architectural debate. In this regard, André Jacque argues that, I quote, we should consider architecture as a critical platform that builds a society in permanent debate, end of quote. He studied the concept of non-familiar domesticities in two of his most relevant texts, The Home as a Political Arena and the book Dulces Arenas Cotidianas, Notas sobre el urbanismo de las domesticidades no familiares activas en lo político. Jacque studies today's domestic interiors and points out that they are not consolidated only in terms of family ties. He also proposes the concept of urban assemblages, to study the contemporary city as a series of domestic spaces, including housing, among other topics. He argues that in a context of absolute globalization and permanent connection through the internet and different networks, the personal and the collective are in constant interaction. These are very useful arguments to think about with this exercise, and could be a starting point from which to think post-occupancy. So in conclusion, the limits of the domestic space are vanishing, and so is the culture of opposition. That binarism that separates day and night, open and closed, work from leisure, work and intimacy, men from women, hetero and homo, has been functional to a patriarchal system that placed men on the outside in social, public, and productive life, and women on the domesticated, controlled, and reproductive interior. This approach is inevitably influenced by different sources that study architecture with a gender perspective, and that allow us to understand that the opposition between the public sphere and the private sphere expired. That the notion of the domestic interior as a shell and as a case is gone, and so is the notion of gender roles, we could say, that, I quote, attributes specific capacities, assigns spaces, and grants different priorities to each sex. Following, end of quote, and following Saida Musi's quotation in her book, Mujeres, Casas y Ciudades Más Allá del Umbral. It's important to understand that the concept of domestic space as we know it has been one of the most effective and sustained mechanisms of domestication of society as a whole. I'd like to name some of the authors from different countries that contribute to a common feminist approach to domesticity. Dolores Hayden, Ana Iva Lent, Ana Falú, Beatriz Colomina, Ana Puigjaner, Saida Musi, María Sherazade Giurici, Silvia Federici, Pier Vittorio Aureli, Diana Agres, Leslie Weisman, Paul Preciado, Debra Coleman, Juliana Bruno, Inés Moiset, Susana Torre, Andrés Jacque, Cristina Goberna Pesudo, Carolina Quiroga, among many others. Bearing in mind these considerations, we could say that one of the keys to study post-occupancy is the concept of movement. In a moving society, the house leaves behind its static, motionless, and permanent role, to be installed in the collective imaginary as heterogeneous, dynamic, ever-changing, and almost evanescent place. About the house, Juliana Bruno writes that, I quote, "It is not a still architectural container, but a site of mobile inhabitations. The house embraces the mobility of lived space," end of quote. The house is thought of as a journey to emancipate it from its role of domestic space that limits it to a physical space and to a private and secluded interior. The house is no longer built as a sealed box, permanently colonizing a space designed to force a linear life. Juliana Bruno's house in motion is a free, living, moving house, a house that creates mobile landscapes and embraces the transformations of its co-livers. In the words of Juliana Bruno, I quote, "Home itself is made up of layers of passages that are voyages of habitation. It's not a static notion, but a site of transit. More than simply a point of departure and return, it's a site of continual transformation. End of quote. Moreover, we need this future multi-agent cohabitation to celebrate ambiguity and embrace the proliferation of subjectivities. We need to empty the house to make room for transformation, deformation, and reformulation. And bear in mind the way in which Paul Preciado understands sexuality. He says, I quote, "Sexualities are like languages. They are complex systems of communication, of invention and reproduction of life. It's possible to learn and invent other sexualities, other regimes of production of desire and pleasure." End of quote. Maybe then we'll be able to leave behind the notion of privacy and instead explore different intimacies and interactions. To conclude, I invite you also to think about post-occupancy applying another of Paul Preciado's concept, the one that defines countersexuality. I invite you to apply the concept of countersexuality to architecture and space. He calls us, and I quote, to overcome sexual formalism, reproductive functionalism, and the empire of the binary vision. Countersexuality is an attempt to become strangers to our own sexuality, to denaturalize our own sexual monolingualism, and to lose and invent ourselves in sexual translation. End of quote. I leave you with this challenge, to think about a post-occupancy, a multi-agent cohabitation that understands movement, dynamism, constant social fluctuations, that blurs the boundaries between inside and outside, private and public, and that incorporates the subjectivities of a free society. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you back in class.